Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Denali training webinar for 2020. This is day 2. Today, we're going to be training on the bank reconciliation and the accounts payable module. So we're ready to go ahead and get started here. Looks like there's a few more people just signing on, and we'll go ahead and let them come on as we're going through the introductions here today. All right. So today's webinar is hosted by me, Jeremy Bistline, of course. I'm your trainer today. Nice to meet everybody. Welcome to our day 2 of our training. Today, same as yesterday, if you weren't here yesterday, we asked that you type in any questions you have throughout the webinar in the question section of the webinar toolbar there, the webinar application you're using there. Also, if you're not able to hear very well and you're using your computer speakers, you could probably call in on the phone number. That usually works a lot better for those who are struggling hearing with their computers. So let's go ahead and get started here. So today's agenda, we're going to be talking about the bank reconciliation module and the accounts payable module today. We're going to go over all the different functionalities of bank reconciliation and accounts payable. And I've got the fund accounting program loaded up for today. Any of those who are not using fund accounting, then there's specific functions that fund accounting uses that you will not use in your setup. So I'll explain that as we're going through the training today. But most of it is pretty much the same. There's just a few things that are different with fund accounting as opposed to regular business accounting. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and get started here, and we'll bring up the bank reconciliation module here. So the Denali Bank Rec module, I like to call it the cash management. This is basically set up to track all the deposits and deductions, additions, deductions, deposits, and withdrawals out of the bank accounts for your organization. And just like in the other modules, we always start with the module preferences. So we go here, and this is our setup for module preferences. Bank reconciliation also has the ability for multi-batch mode. You can turn that on or off as needed. Each module has their own setting for that. So if you have multi-batch mode turned on in General Ledger, you may not need to have it turned on in bank reconciliation if you're only working in there one person at a time. But there's one thing about the bank reconciliation. When you reconcile a bank statement, you're only allowed to be working on one bank account reconciliation at a time within the batch. So if you need to be able to reconcile another bank account when you're not done with the first one, then you will want to use multi-batch mode for that so that you can start another reconciliation even though you haven't finished up your first one yet. So it looks like we're still having struggle here with some people not being able to hear. So if you can't hear, try calling in on the phone line and see if that'll help. Give me just a moment here while I respond to one of the attendees. Okay. So the next option is to show bank information on reports. And what that is when you're setting up a bank account, you can put in the bank account number at the bank as part of the bank account setup. But if you want to show that on like a deposit slip report, then you can check that box and it'll print that account number on some of the reports that have that option. The account number is encrypted in the database for security. So that's why this option is here. If you uncheck that box, it doesn't print that number on your reports. It keeps it secure for you. The last option is only available in fund accounting. And what this is for is when you're doing any bank transactions in bank reconciliation, remember yesterday in our class, we talked about not only keeping the general ledger balanced, but you must keep the funds balanced as well. So any transactions that you're running through bank rec that would be crossing funds, the system will automatically generate the due to, due from entries to keep those funds balanced. But specifically what this is for is this is if you are a fund accounting organization using our fund accounting, but you want to track all of the cash for each bank account in just one general ledger cash account for each bank account. So if you had 3 bank accounts, you would have 3 general ledger cash accounts on the balance sheet to tell you how much money you have in each of those 3 accounts. But with fund accounting, some of that money in your bank account might belong to Fund A, but some of it might belong to Fund B in the same bank account. So by utilizing the auto due to, due from, the system will keep track of that for you and still let you track your balances for each account in a single general ledger account in fund accounting. However, if you don't use that option, then bank reconciliation will automatically separate by fund how much cash each fund has separately across each bank account. So if you have 4 funds, each bank account has to have 4 separate cash accounts in the general ledger. It's the same account, but it's just tracked separately by fund. And that way you're keeping your funds balanced. That is required for restricted funds. Even if this option is checked, but any of your funds are restricted, the restricted funds, remember that fund transfer type we talked about, those funds that are set as restricted will still have to have a separate cash account on their fund setup in order to track how much money they have in that bank account, that specific fund. But if you don't need that, utilizing the auto due to, due from allows you to put all of the cash into a single general ledger line on the balance sheet, the total cash for each bank account, instead of splitting it by fund. And the fund number you use here is which fund is going to house the cash. I like to call this the cash custodian fund, because this is basically the line, the cash account on the balance sheet will just be coded to the one fund. In my example, it's the administration fund, as you can see there. And since that is a due to, due from fund, then I can select that fund. Now, my federal fund is not on this list because it's a restricted fund, so it has to have a separate cash account. Usually, though, for restricted accounts, you're going to have a separate bank account anyway for restricted funds. But it doesn't have to be that way in Denali. You can use the same bank account. You just have to keep that fund's portion of their cash separate in the general ledger because it's restricted. So let's talk about the integration settings. This is the first time we've seen this. Yesterday, we did not have any integration settings because remember what we talked about. Denali's rule number 1, general ledger, very selfish. Don't make journal entries to the control accounts in general ledger. Let the other modules take care of the balances of those accounts. And we're going to go into that a little more detail when I get to the bank account setup here. So how do the other modules talk to general ledger? Well, BankRec will talk to general ledger in my setup, what we call detailed, which means every transaction will post to the general ledger separately when I post the batch. Every transaction has its own set of debits and credits that will post to the general ledger. It looks like one big posting report, but each line on that posting report is coded to one of the transactions in the batch. You may have multiple lines on the same transaction. That's perfectly normal. But the other option is summary integration. What that does is instead of doing each transaction separately, posting those to the general ledger, it will just post the batch totals. So every general ledger account that gets a posting is going to just have one line in that posting with the batch totals for that account, rather than each transaction separate. The condensed option is kind of a compromise between the two. What it does is it'll still post the summary of the batch for the balance sheet type accounts, but you still get the detail for the batch to the revenue and expense accounts, or in business, the income and expense accounts. So if you want to see the detail on your income and expense or revenue and expenses, but you don't need the detail on the balance sheet accounts in the general ledger, just the batch totals is all that works. The condensed will do that for you. Of course, the first option is integration off. If you turn off the integration to general ledger, when you post a batch here in the bank rec module, nothing goes to general ledger at all. It's just turned off and general ledger won't even see it. So we don't want to do that. Usually that's only done in the initial setup while you're putting in your opening balance entries and your outstanding items when you're first setting up Denali. But once everything's set up and the balances line up between bank rec and GL, make sure your integration is turned on, and then don't do journal entries to those control accounts at that point. Question: how will the transactions appear in the general ledger for reconciliation purposes and audit purposes? It's a great question. In detail, each and every debit and each and every credit for each and every transaction will show up in detail in the audit trail. Summary only shows the batch totals, and the description for that posting will just simply say summary integration. So condensed, like we said, it'll show the summary integration on the balance sheet account, but you'll still get the detail on the revenue and expense account. So the detail is recommended, but if you print your general ledger posting reports, it will use a lot more paper because you're getting all the lines for each transaction in the batch that'll be printed out on that report. But you will get that complete detailed audit trail if you do that in the general ledger. So that is the recommended integration setting for that. But for the bank rec module, everything will always go in individually for bank reconciliation. Every transaction you post to bank rec, no matter what you set here, will show up in the reconciliation and in the bank register individually and separately. You also have print options in all of the modules. The print options allow you to determine where you want to send reports to when you run a report in the bank rec module. All of the modules have these options, and some of them have different options based on which module it is, such as the checks here in bank rec, if you want to print checks out of bank rec. So your options is sending them to the printer directly, or sending them to the screen, or you could just send them to a file. Now, if you do printer or file, then you can pick some other options here. How many copies do you want? And which printer do you want to send those reports to? Or just send them to the Windows default printer on the current workstation. You can also select this box here. If you select this box here that says Edit, then when you run a report, even though you have these options set here, you can still change those options at the time you run the report. You get that little pop-up that says printer, screen, or file. That's what this does. If you don't check that box, it won't give you those options. It's always going to go to where this option is set. Always going to just send it to the printer when you go to run the report. Now, if you go to screen, that is required. That edit box has to be checked if you go to screen. Some options here, like checks, you cannot go to screen with checks. Those have to go to the printer. And you do have the option in bank rec to look at that, but since it has to go to the printer, there's really no option there. It'll just send that straight to the printer when you print. Some reports do have an option to save the report as a CSV file for Microsoft Excel, which we talked about that yesterday. You can tell the system here where those CSV files are to be saved. You can browse for a specific location that you want to save those to. The warn before overriding, that just pops up a warning if you're about to save a file to this location, but there's already a file with that exact file name already saved there. It'll pop up this warning to let you know you're going to override the one that's there. Or if you don't care to see that, you can uncheck that box. It'll just do it automatically. Okay, now in business accounting, one thing I didn't show you, business accounting does not use the auto do to do from. That's only available in fund accounting, so you won't see that option if you're using Denali Business. All right, your preferences are set up. Now you go through and set up your bank accounts here in the bank rec module. So when you open up the account maintenance screen for the bank rec, each bank account must have a code up to 6 characters. And I've got one here. We'll use Bank of America, This is my code for my bank account here in BankRec. And you can give it a description as well. Whatever you want to type there is fine. The account type that you'll be using here is checking, saving, investment, and credit card. But if you're using the accounts payable module, then we recommend setting up your credit cards in accounts payable rather than doing that here in BankRec. The accounts payable has a much better system for tracking those payables on the credit card. If you don't have the accounts payable module, you can set up credit cards here in BankRec to be tracked. And then this is the account number at the bank. This is optional. You're not required to fill that in if you don't want to. Then you have to specify at least one of the GL accounts in this list here. The one you have to specify is the checking account. That's the cash account in the general ledger for this bank account in BankRec. Now notice here in fund accounting, we talked about this yesterday, I had 3 segments. I had the account number, a program number, and a fund number. But on this account up here, it's not asking me for the fund number. And the reason why is because this bank account is this account for all funds. So when you're setting up the cash account in GL, you'll establish the segments except for the fund. And you have to set up that same account all across the segments. The only difference is your fund is going to be set up differently for each fund. And if you have money in this account for any funds in the general ledger, you must set this account up for each fund that's going to have money in this bank account. It's going to have a cash balance in this bank account. The other accounts are optional when you're setting up the bank account here. These are just the default accounts for these types of bank transactions. So the opposing deposit account, this is just the default account that gets the credit side of the entry when you make a bank deposit. It's just a default though. You can change that to something else on the deposit itself if needed. But that is the default. It'll always flag it to if you don't make any changes when you enter that deposit. So question, what is the relationship between the bank account and opposing deposit account? Show us one sample of use of each account. Good example. So when we get to the transaction entry, I will be sure to show you that. But in a nutshell, what it means is when I enter a bank deposit, it's going to credit this account and debit the cash account in the general ledger. That's what that's for. If I enter a bank charge, it's going to debit the bank charge account here and credit the cash account because that's an expense. So it's taking money out of cash. And for those of you who are in accounting, remember, if you credit an asset, it reduces the balance. If you debit the asset, it increases the balance. And cash is an asset in your general ledger. So if you enter a bank charge transaction, it will debit the bank charge account here and credit the cash account up here. The fund that it picks determines the expense or the deposit. So the cash account that gets the debit or credit always links to the opposing account in fund accounting. Now in business accounting, you don't deal with funds. So it's just one account for each of these. You can still have segments, but it has to be the exact same account number all the way through every segment well, you only have one account in the general ledger for cash. You won't have multiple cash accounts for the same bank account in business accounting. And the last one is the adjustments account. That's a default account for bank adjustments. Bank adjustments are entered as either additions or deductions in the BankRec module. So if you fill these accounts here, if you fill these in here on the account setup, whenever you make these transactions in the BankRec, it'll automatically code those to these accounts unless you change it on the transaction itself. If you don't want that to happen automatically, just leave these accounts blank. Don't fill them in. Then that'll force you to enter an opposing account on that transaction. The cash account will always go to this account for the bank account here when you do a transaction. The only one you don't have a default for is actual checks. because checks can go to any expense. So we didn't program it to do a default expense for checks. You can also fill in the bank address here, the bank name, contact person, the bank address under the address tab, phone number, email, website, the information is needed there. The financial tab shows a snapshot of the account, shows the current balance, which is also displayed up here, shows the statement, last statement reconciliation, the last statement that was reconciled, the statement date is what that is, and then the last statement balance. Then you have totals of each transaction type that are still outstanding for this bank account that haven't been cleared through the reconciliation yet. These are transactions that are posted, but they're not marked off as have cleared the bank yet through the reconciliation. Down here is the last check and the last deposit that posted to this account. The general settings, this allows you to change the method on how you reconcile the bank statement. You can do statement to book, or you can do book to statement. Statement to book starts with the statement, and then it takes the outstanding deposits and subtracts those, and the outstanding checks and adds those in to get your book balance to match. Book to statement does the opposite of that. It starts with the book balance, which is what the Denali balance shows here, and adds and subtracts. I think I had that backwards. I think this book to statement adds outstanding deposits, subtracts outstanding checks, but statement to book does the reverse of that to the balance. I always get those mixed up. And then the way the reconciliation is reported on your reconciliation report is just based on what you have set here. You can also default when you're reconciling how you want items to show up on the reconciliation screen, by date, by item number. And of course, you can change this as you're reconciling, but this is just the first set of transactions that pop up on the screen, how you want those to be as a default. There's an option here to suppress accounts payable checks. Basically, the accounts payable checks are not included in the reconciliation. I still don't know the full reason of why that's there. I think we had some issues way back in the days when we had some clients using accounts payable and bank rec, but they wanted to use them separately, so they didn't want to include those in the reconciliation. Don't check that box. Typically leave that unchecked, because you definitely want your accounts payable checks to all be included in the bank reconciliation. The check format allows you to determine what check stock you're using, either laser or dot matrix. And then if you're setting up Denali for electronic funds transfers with this bank account, then you would set up a 3-character code here that Denali flags and uses for those EFT transactions. That's just an internal code in the Denali system. You can set one up for payables and receivables, and you can even use the same code for both if you want. The bank notes, you can type anything you need to hear about the bank account. You can click timestamp to insert the date and time on your note. Attachments, this is where you can attach documents to the bank account right here in Denali. We actually have clients that use this feature to attach the monthly bank statement. The bank statement, they just log into the website, the bank's website, and download the statement in PDF and attach it here. And then they have access to it at any time right here in Denali. One thing I'll show you here too is you've got 2 numbers here that shows the balance of this bank account. You have the current balance and the current GL balance. So this is a real quick check to make sure that your general ledger and your bank reconciliation module are balanced with each other. So if these 2 numbers are ever not in balance, if those 2 numbers are different, what do you suppose would cause that? I'll let you think on that for a sec, and then I'll answer that for you. The number one cause of these balances being thrown off is somebody broke our rule number 1. and they made a journal entry to this cash account in the general ledger. Because general ledger will not tell BankRec what that entry was. So if you make a journal entry to the cash account, it's going to update the GL balance, but it's not going to touch the BankRec balance here at the top. So don't do that. If you need to make an entry, a journal entry to cash, instead of a journal entry, come in here and do a bank adjustment for that instead. And you don't have to have it code to this default account. You can code the opposing side of that adjustment to whatever you want it to be. So you'll either do an addition if you're increasing the cash balance, or you will do a deduction if you're decreasing the cash balance. And we'll talk about that on the transaction entry here in just a few minutes. There's one more thing I wanted to show you though in the BankRec setup. Remember yesterday when we were looking in the controller module, there was a third-party option called Yodlee integration. Well, the Yodlee integration, what that does for you is it allows you to connect your bank account here in Denali with your bank account at the bank, the actual bank itself. And by doing that, the system can be set up to automatically reconcile your bank statements each month. There's the option to automatically do that. So when you set up Yodlee, you'll set up a login and password, and then you're going to click this button that says Open Yodlee Fast Link once it's set up. And then this will launch the Yodlee site, and of course it's going to launch on my other screen. Hang on just a sec. Now this site pops up within the Cougar Mountain integration. So then you just simply select your bank that your bank account is at. And these are the most common banks throughout the US, the most common users. If you don't see your bank here, just click this button here and you can do a search to type in your bank. And look at that, there's my bank right there. So when I select that, then Yodlee is asking, what is your login credentials at the bank? You just simply enter those credentials, and when you hit submit, as long as the system verifies those credentials, it validates the connection, and now you are fully integrated with the bank and with Denali. So good question. Let's go back here. So one question is, somebody asked, is Ameris Bank on there? When you're setting this up, just click here and type it in, see if you can find it. And let's see if it comes up here. And there it is. So then you just simply type in your login credentials and it will link to Denali. Once that link is done, then that activates the Yodlee integration so that when you go into the BankRec module and you're setting up your bank account, you'll still set it up the same, but then Denali is asking for this bank account, which account is that linked to at the bank? And you'll see the list of all of your accounts at the bank that you can select from. You can have as many accounts that you need to through this integration. Another good question, is there a charge for Yodlee? No, there's not. Yodlee is included with your bank reconciliation module at no additional cost. So you don't need to, you don't have to pay any extra, and the bank won't charge you anything because all the bank is doing is just giving Denali access to your login information at the bank. So unless they charge you for online access, then they're not going to charge you for Yodlee either. And most banks, it's free. Online banking is free with most banks nowadays. So. All right, that is the bank account set up. So once your bank accounts are set up, now you're ready to use the BankRec module. So the BankRec transactions are entered here, enter account activity. So again, if you need to make a journal entry to cash, you're going to go here to do it, not here. Do not make journal entries to the control account because the control accounts are the accounts that are tracking the balances for the other modules. In this case, the cash accounts here set up on your bank account. Those are control accounts. Now, these opposing accounts are not control accounts. They're just simply defaults for those types of transactions. But the cash account here is a control account. So do not make journal entries to the control account, or you'll throw these two numbers off here if you do. But to make a journal entry to a cash account, you'll go here to do it instead. So let's say I need to adjust the bank balance. I need to decrease the balance by $50 for whatever reason. So I'll put in my bank code. Here's how I do the journal entry. The adjustments are done as a deduction if you're reducing, or an addition if you're increasing. These are the activity types that you can choose from. Okay, there was another question for Yodlee. Are the credentials defined by the bank or by Yodlee? For example, when you log in, I need to use a username, password, and a token from a token generator. You know, that is a really good question. And the reason I'm glad you asked that is because if you have to use a token for every login, Yodlee is not going to work for that. But your bank should offer you what's called a read-only login specific for accounting software applications. And if they give you that login, it won't require the token. It's a special login only used for this kind of an integration. Most of the banks that require the tokens, they'll have that special read-only login that doesn't allow you to make any changes to the account. It just basically downloads the data for reconciliation. That's all it's doing. So if your bank offers that, then you should still be able to get it to work. Otherwise, Yodlee may not be an option for you if they do not offer that read-only that doesn't require the token. And what a token is, for those of you who are curious, what that is it's a little fob that the bank gives you, or sometimes it's just a little authentication app on your phone. The banks have different methods for doing that. That every time you log into your bank online, you enter your username and password, then it'll ask you for a code that comes from this little fob or this app or some other method. It's like a three-step authentication is what it is, or a two-step authentication. Yodlee doesn't work with that, so keep that in mind and see if your bank can set you up with a special login that doesn't require that for read-only. Okay, so the activity type, the default is a check. That just means you're writing a check here. If you write a check, you're going to put in a date. The check number is only required if you're not going to print the check. But if you're going to print the check, you can leave that blank here because you can assign the check number at printing instead. And then you must fill in the payee, who the check was written to. The optional fields here, you can put in a description for this check if you want. And you can also fill in the address that prints on the check as well. But if you're using accounts payable, I don't recommend writing checks here because there's no vendor tracking of these checks through the payable system like there would be in accounts payable. So if you need to write a check and you use accounts payable, let's do that in the accounts payable module instead. And those will automatically post to the bank rec here to the bank account. But you may need to do other transactions like a deposit. If you don't use accounts receivable or sales, you may have to enter a deposit in bank rec for any revenue or income that's coming in. So the deposits, they don't require a payee, but they do require a description. Well, the description's optional, but the deposit number is required. That one you cannot leave blank. And that's just basically your reference number you want to use for this deposit. It also must be a unique number. Each transaction cannot have a number, or each transaction has to have their own unique reference number. So you cannot use the same number that was used in a prior transaction. That's not an option. And then you come down here in the grid. This is deposits for, you code your deposit to the different income accounts, but you notice there's an account that populated automatically. And that's to answer your question earlier, how do those accounts relate to each other in the setup? This account automatically populated as the opposing account for this deposit because it was set up right here on the opposing deposit account. If I left that blank, this would have been left blank here. I'd have to manually fill it in. But I can still change it here if I need to. And you can also fill in as many lines as you need to on the deposit as needed. Maybe you need to code this to a revenue, not to undeposited funds. See, this is the undeposited funds account I have because I do revenues through journal entries, but the debit side of that doesn't hit my control account. It hits an undeposited funds account, which is like a cash clearing. And then I come in here and make my bank deposit. Or my revenues are coming through sales or accounts receivable going to undeposited funds. Another question, talking about printing checks. On occasion, we have somebody here that's attending the class today that says they do have to print out a check in BankRec on occasion when you're clearing an account. But how does it print the same as you can get it to print in accounts payable? When you first set up Denali, the check form that is used to print should be the same for both accounts payable and BankRec. The stubs might look a little different, but the check itself should be the same. But if you had a customized check modification done for accounts payable, you must also have that same modification done for BankRec as well. Otherwise, your checks will not come out the same. And so if you need that modification done, we can help you with that. Just contact customer service and our Crystal Reports expert will get back with you to get that done. Or if you have the Crystal Reports program yourself, you can do it yourself if you know how. It's a little complicated, but a lot of our folks do. They have the program and they just do their own modifications. So. All right, so when you're coding deposits to different revenues, let's say I'm going to code it to $4,000 administration, but then I'm going to code $50 to grants and fellowships. Let's give us a deposit number here. Okay, revenue, I'll just call it revenue for the memo. Revenue. Now, when you're filling out the details for the transaction, you can type whatever you want on each line. You can even put like an invoice number. If this was a check, you could put an invoice number that you're paying on each line for that check. And that's what that's for. Or if it's a deposit coming in, you could put like the check number you're depositing from the person who paid the money to you or from whoever you received the money from. So it's up to you how you want to fill this out. It's entirely up to you on that. Now for a deposit, you can code each line as cash or not as needed. And what that does is that only is used on the deposit slip form. All of the lines that are coded as cash will be lumped together in a single line at the top of your deposit slip. All of the ones that are not coded as cash will still be listed separately on the deposit slip. And then I've got a $150 deposit here to the same GL account, but across two different funds. That's how that works. When I hit save, that saves it in the batch, but it's not posted yet. Remember in Denali, you have to post everything before it's done. I can also void transactions that I've already posted by using the void bank account activity if needed. And this is real simple. You just select which bank account, and then you can double click right here, the item to void. You can double click and it'll bring up a list of all the outstanding transactions that have not yet been marked as cleared. Any items in here, you can void if they're outstanding. There is an exception to that though. The only items you can void are any items that you have entered here in BankRec. You cannot void checks right here on this screen that you have posted from the accounts payable module. You must go to the accounts payable to void those checks. You're not allowed to come into BankRec to void those. Because just like rule number 1, there's another rule, rule number 2, that says always go to the original module where the original transaction was posted from if you have to fix it. Now that one isn't quite so critical, but it's pretty important to do that. There are exceptions to that rule, but for the most part, this is a perfect example of that rule applying If you write a check out of accounts payable, you cannot void it here in bank rec. You must go to accounts payable to void that check. But if the check was posted right here in bank rec, you can go ahead and void that here. And it brings up the information here of the original entry. And then you can enter the date you want it to be voided. Typically, that's going to be the same day as the original. And that just does a direct reversal of that transaction. And it'll mark it as void instead of outstanding in your check register. But I didn't save that, but I did save the one entry, the deposit we made. Back to this real quick. I kind of got off on a little bit of a alternate route here. I was talking about journal entries to the cash account. That's a big no-no. If you need to make an entry, you do that as a deduction. You still have to give it a reference number. And if you want to give it a description and put in a memo line, you can. And then this is the opposing account for the deduction. So your journal entry would look like this. You don't have to do a credit to cash. That's done for you automatically. All you need to do is do the debit side to that. And that's what this account here is. And then that does your journal entry for you, and you're not breaking Rule 1. It'll keep the current bank balance and the GL balances lined up. And therefore, you don't have to make the journal entry directly in General Ledger. Bank Rec will do the journal entry for you. Question, would you ever enter items in both accounts payable and Bank Rec? I don't foresee that you would need to do that unless for some reason you don't have the accounts payable integration turned on to Bank Rec. If you're not posting the checks from accounts payable to Bank Rec, then you're probably going to have to put those into the Bank Rec module too, because those didn't post from AP. But typically, you're going to set your integrations in accounts payable to post all checks to Bank Rec, and of course, the detailed integration to GL. We'll talk about that with the AP module training. So that's another question. All of our uncleared checks show up in the void Bank Rec transaction screen. So the question is, why does that happen? If the checks are coming from accounts payable, why does it even let you select that check here in the Bank Rec module? You know, that is a good question. The system is just programmed to select anything that's outstanding. But if you select a check, and that check came from AP, it'll tell you here. When you try to save that, it's going to say, nope, you can't, because that came from accounts payable. You cannot void that here. All right, so another question. Can be voided after posting or only outstanding? So posting and outstanding are not the same thing. When you post a transaction, even after it's posted, it's still outstanding. So yes, you can still void it after posting because it's not cleared yet. It's just posted in Denali. Cleared means that it's already been through the bank. And that happens on the reconciliation when you reconcile the bank statement for all posted transactions. That's where they're going to be marked as cleared. So the question is, can I void a cleared transaction? The answer is no, you cannot. And more specifically, the question is, what if I cleared it by mistake and it shouldn't have been cleared? You cannot void it. You're going to have to do an adjusting entry to reverse it if that happens. And remember, adjustments are done here, not as journal entries. So that's the way it's going to have to work. And yes, another question is, once the transaction is voided, will it show as voided? Yes. If you had posted it before you voided, then you can void it and post the void, and that'll show up in the register as a voided entry. And you'd actually see that in the check register. All right, so now that we've got our deposit entered, The only thing I've saved in this batch is just the deposit. We'll show you what that looks like. This is our edit report. This is going to show us a report of everything in the current batch, and there should only be that one deposit. And there it is. So to zoom in on that, you can see it a little better. Our total deposit's $150. It's allocated across two revenue lines here. These are the revenue accounts in the general ledger. Same account, just two different funds. So what does that look like when I post? For business accounting, it's just going to debit the cash and credit each of those revenue lines their amounts. It's going to be one debit to cash, but it's going to be an individual credit to each revenue or income line that you code that deposit to, or whatever the opposing accounts were. If they're not income, it's whatever they were, maybe undeposited funds. But fund accounting works a little different, and it is entirely based on whether you're using the auto do to do from or not. I'll show you how it works. So here's my posting report. So there's my deposit, $150. Now the posting doesn't show the detail here because you have another posting report waiting to run in BankRec, and there it is. It's my general ledger posting. A little more complex for fund accounting. What you're going to see is $150 to the cash, like you should, right there. But then I have a $50 due to credit in the administration and a $50 due from debit to grants and fellowship for this $50 revenue recording credit down here to grants and fellowship. So it kept my fund balance. $100 credit went to the administration revenue. There is no due to do from on that because that's where my cash is. But the other $50, I had to run that through my due to do froms because I crossed over funds there, and it did that for me automatically. Again, that's only fund accounting. For those who don't use fund accounting, don't worry about all that if it's too confusing to you, because it doesn't apply. You would just see a $150 debit here, and you would just see a $150 credit, or maybe if you had that credit split across multiple accounts, you would see that listed separately. But there would be no other debits or credits typically that you would see. So let's talk about your journal entry one more time on your adjustments or your additions or deductions. Sometimes you do a journal entry that may have many lines, and one of those lines is your cash account for the bank. If that's the case, you're going to fill that entry out here. Whatever lines you need to fill in, you can do that. $50 there, $100 there. But what if I need to do a deduction out of this? What if I need to debit some other line? Because remember, these are all credits on an addition. The debit goes to my cash account. What if I have other debits as well? Well, that's simply done by doing a negative dollar amount on your entry. Now we reduce the debit to cash right here. Net amount has been reduced, and it's going to debit this account because it's a negative. These are credits. This is a debit. That's how you're going to fill out journal entries. So you fill it out just like a journal entry, but you use positives and negatives instead of debits and credits, with one exception. The cash line is not included in your entry here because it's automatically included for you to go to the cash account here. So you don't have to enter the cash line. Now, you have to think this through, because if you're doing a deduction, all this is reversed. Now we're debiting the positives and we're crediting the negative, because the net amount is going to be a credit to cash. So you can run your journal entries however you need to here. As long as you do it here, not in general ledger, and therefore you're not breaking rule number 1. All right, another thing we need to cover that's important, especially for fund accounting, is there's one transaction type in here that I didn't talk to specifically about, and that is a transfer. Notice when I select transfer, everything changed here in the detail section of this transaction. So in business accounting, transfers are real easy. You put in the account you're transferring from, the bank account, then you select the bank account you're transferring to. Let's see, I need to make a transfer to cover payroll this week out of my general account. So I'm going to do a transfer to the payroll account. Here's the date of my transfer. I still need a transaction number, and it must be unique. You cannot duplicate transaction numbers. And then a description. You can also fill in a memo on this if you would like, but it's optional. The description is optional as well. Then you fill in the amount of your weekly payroll, or whatever the transfer is. You fill in the amount of the transfer. And for business accounting, that's all you need. You don't have to worry about it. That's it. You just simply hit save and it's done. But for fund accounting, there's also this general ledger account field. What is that for? Well, the reason that's required is because when you're doing a bank transfer, if you're crossing funds, it needs to know what to put in for due to, due from. And most of the time you won't be crossing funds, but it still has to have an account here. You cannot leave that blank. So you just simply select your due from account for that, of whatever fund that the transfer is for. Make sure you select the right fund that it's for if you're not transferring funds. And that's how you're going to run bank transfers in fund accounting. Fill in your due to, due from account. If you don't use due to, due from, if everything is restricted, you'll have to pick an alternate clearing account for that. But basically what's going to happen on this transfer is it's just simply going to pass through that account. I'll show you on the impact summary how that works. So there's the edit report, but here's how it's going to hit general ledger. Oh, I must have closed out of my Adobe. Popping up on the other screen here. There you go. So we're getting our debit and credit where it needs to be. We're crediting the general account, debiting the payroll account. But in the process, it has to do a pass-through to the due to, due from account, but it's the same account. So the net effect to general ledger to this account is 0. It's just going to debit and credit that account with a net 0. If we were crossing funds, it would debit the one funds due from and credit the other funds due to automatically based on whichever account you chose in the due to, due from section. So that's why that's required in fund accounting, just because we have to keep everything balanced. And most of the time, just go ahead and put in that one account, you're good to go. It'll just debit and credit it, and then there's no mix up or hang up as to where it all goes. It's just going to be a net 0. So basically what it is this debit has to have an opposing credit, and it's that credit right there. Now this credit up here has to have an opposing debit. It's that debit right there is your opposing debit. So we're good to go there. So for fund accounting, just fill in any account you want to use as the clearing account for your transfer. It'll just debit and credit the same account with a net 0 as part of that bank transfer. Okay. So your bank transactions are entered there. At any point, you can open up the bank account maintenance here. And you can bring up the bank register quickly. And here's where you can see whether the transaction is cleared, outstanding, or voided. You'll see that most of these are old, so they're cleared. If I do this date most recent first, this is by item number. Date most recent first. There it is. So here's These are the outstanding ones here. And here's one that's marked as voided because that's been voided now. But wait a minute, Jeremy, I thought you couldn't void checks from AP. You can void checks from AP. You just have to go to the AP module to do it. You can't do it here in bank rec. So yes, you can still void them. You just have to do it in the right place. Here's another one right here. You can also run a register report. You can run this report for all bank accounts or for just a single bank account. The options you have is to select how you want the item sorted, date, item number, so forth. And then you put in the date range of the items you want to see on this report. You can also say, only show me the outstanding item, or only show me the cleared item, or just the voided item, or pick and choose. You can also pick and choose, only show me accounts payable checks and nothing else on this report. Or let's see the payroll checks too, or accounts receivable deposits, or all activity from bank rec. You can also specify a specific activity type that you want to see. Now notice transfers is not in here. Transfers are deductions and additions. When you do that bank transfer, it does a deduction out of one account and an addition to the other account. So that's how it'll show up in the register. And then you run that okay. Oh, I got to select the activity type. And there's the bank register report right there. As soon as it pops up here. And there it is. And at the bottom of this report, I ran it for the whole year, so there's a bunch of stuff on here. You have your totals here. Total checks, total deposits, total deductions, additions, and bank charges, and total voids with the net activity here for what's on this register. All right. Question, when a check is voided, does the system go back to the period that it was initially posted on the GL? That depends. Whenever you void a check or any transaction, you get to decide what period it's going to post to based on the date that you, come on. Okay, here we go. You put in the date you want the void to be coded to. Typically, it's the same day as the original one, which you'll see down here, the transaction date, but it doesn't have to be if you need the void to post in a different period. Another question, is there a way to print the check register in Excel? There is actually. Use the CSV option is going to be the best option for that when you go to run the bank register report. Now, this is fairly new. We just added the CSV option to the bank register in just a couple of releases back. So if you don't have that option, then you'll need to do a Denali upgrade to get the latest release, which will include that. All right, and what is the purpose of the payee card file? The payee card file is used to track people that you write checks to. It doesn't give you like vendor history and aging and all that like you get out of accounts payable, but it allows you to save information for a payee so you don't have to fill it out every time, their address and phone number and all that, every time you issue a check to that payee. And then you can also run the check register by a specific payee as well. And they don't have to be set up in the payee card file to run it by payee. If they're set up in accounts payable as a vendor, that will also be tracked here as well. Okay, now that we've got all of our entries posted, then at the end of the month, you're going to get the bank statement from the bank, and you'll go here to reconcile that statement. When you click this button here, it's asking you, oh, let me do a refresh of that so I can show you the process. Yes. By the way, I can clear my current reconciliation by bringing it up on the reconciliation menu. And you can also clear all transactions within a current batch, within a specific batch, the current batch you're in, by clearing the transactions there. And that means they're just deleted. They never posted, so you can go ahead and delete the whole batch if you need to. For reconciliation, you put in the bank account, then you put in your statement ending date here, and you also put in your statement ending date here as the cutoff date. This is not start to end. Keep that in mind. This is end to end. Statement ending date on both of these is what you want here. Now, the cutoff date, you can go out an extra few days into the following month, but what that does is that will list all the entries here in the reconciliation grid up through the cutoff date, which is why typically you're going to put the statement ending date, because you're not going to have anything on the bank statement that was dated after the statement ending date. So you don't need to clear those yet. Another question, is there a way to have the company name but a different name printed on the check? You cannot do that in the bank rec module, but yes, you can do that in accounts payable. And I'll show you how to do that. So set them up as a vendor, and then you can have that option if needed. So you start to end is not right. It's statement ending date, and cutoff day is also statement ending date. Ending statement balance, whatever that is. And then by default, because that's how it's set up in the account, the items will be sorted by date. So I hit refresh grid, and everything comes in that's outstanding. Only the outstanding transactions will come up here, sorted by date, up through the cutoff date. Or I could sort them by item number if I prefer to do my reconciliation by check number. And there's my check numbers. Or I can sort this list by any of these options here. When reconciling, you can also reconcile it here just like you see it on the bank statement. A lot of bank statements, what they'll do is they'll list the deposits first. So you can uncheck all activity types and just do the deposits only. Refresh the grid, and now all I see are deposits here. And if it's on the bank statement, I just mark it cleared. That's how items are cleared from outstanding. If the item isn't on the bank statement, don't mark it cleared. Leave it outstanding. Skip that one so that it'll still be there for the next bank statement because it might clear the next month. When I get done with deposits, I save what I've done, and now I can reconcile the checks. Refresh the grid. Now all I see are checks. Checks I like to do by item number though, because typically that's how they're listed on the bank statement. And I go through and mark each of those that have cleared. Or if they haven't cleared, I skip it, don't mark it. Save that one. When that's done, then I can do the other miscellaneous transactions. I can even do multiples at the same time if I want. These are deductions, additions, and bank charges. Mark those ones that have cleared. Or if they haven't cleared, leave it unchecked. Now, if everything comes out the way it should, when you're all done here, refresh the grid. See, it still kept the ones marked now that I went back to all transactions. It still kept the ones marked that I'd marked. These are by item numbers. So there's the ones at the bottom for those. When you're done, you should be balanced at the bottom here. You should not be out of balance. If you are out of balance, something's missing. We either have something on the bank statement we did not mark as cleared here, or we marked something cleared here that wasn't on the bank statement. Question comes up, can I do a daily reconcile? You can actually do this daily, yes, but you don't want to post it until the end of the month when you actually have the bank statement in hand. So as you're working on this, you can save your work and you can close out. You can even shut everything down. When you come back in here, it just picks up where you left off until you post. And you can save that batch, keep that batch open for the entire month. But if you've got multiple bank accounts and you want to do that throughout the month, you will need multi-batch mode for that because you have to have a separate batch for each reconciliation that you're working on. Then when you're done, you print the reconciliation report. This report will list out all of the outstanding checks, deposits. Let's see if I can show an example of that here. There it is. It will list out it shows the statement balance, net outstanding items outside the cutoff date. That's just a grand total of all items past that cutoff day. And then it will list out each item individually on or before the cutoff day. So you can see the list of items that are still outstanding. You did not mark as cleared. The next report is the preview. That one is the list of all the items you did mark as cleared, and it will show the totals at the bottom of that report. If I go back here to, if I do this one, it's going to be about 50 pages because I've got a lot of items I didn't mark as cleared that are before the cutoff date. So that's what you'll see there. Oh, it's only 3 pages. I guess that's not too bad. Those are my outstanding checks, totals. Then I have my outstanding deposits. And then there's the calculated book balance and the actual book balance. Those two should match and your difference should be 0. If it's not, you're not done reconciling yet. You've got to go back and fix something. And here's the cleared items. If this is done right, then what you'll see here is a list of everything you marked as cleared. That's the edit report for your reconciliation. And at the bottom, you'll have total checks, total deposits, total deductions, additions, and bank charges. Those should be the same totals that are actually on the bank statement itself. Total checks, total deposits, this should match those. They might not match exactly in these categories, but they basically should match, and the net amount should definitely match. If they don't match, that means something's missing. That means we didn't balance. And then once everything's done and everything's balanced, then you would post. You go ahead and click OK, and you post the reconciliation, but look what happened. It says, no, you can't post because you're not balanced. So it will not let you post until your reconciliation is balanced. And when it does post, when it finally does let you, the system will clear out all those entries that you marked as cleared instead of leaving them outstanding in the database, and it resets the reconciliation for that bank account for the next month. Now, question just came up. What about automatic reconciliation? What about Yodlee? I thought that was supposed to do all this for us, right? Well, yeah, it is. So the way you do Yodlee is you put in the bank account. Now, because I don't have Yodlee set up on an actual bank here, this is just a demonstration company, this button's going to disappear. But, oh, it stayed there. Okay. But when I click on it, it won't do anything here. See, there's nothing listed. The way it works with the Yodlee is you put in your bank information, your cutoff day, and your statement ending day, your cutoff day. You still have to put that in, your statement ending balance. But what it does is it saves you from having to check all of these boxes individually one at a time, where you have to go through and look at the bank statement, and if it's on the bank statement, you check it. Yodlee saves you that. Instead, you just click this button, and Yodlee will connect to your bank, and it'll bring up a list of all of your checks at the bank that the bank downloaded to Denali on this column here. All the transactions, not just the checks, but everything. Then over here, it will match it to the Denali transaction, the corresponding transaction that was posted either here in bank rec or accounts payable. And it'll tell you the status if it's a match or not. Any of them that it's not able to match up, the Denali transaction will be left blank and it'll just say unmatched right here. But at that point, you can select from the dropdown. Each line will have a little dropdown here. You can select from a list of the current outstanding transactions in Denali to match it up with yourself if it's not able to do it automatically. but even that's not required. What happens is when you click OK, all of the ones that did match will automatically be checked for you. The ones that didn't match, of course, will be left unchecked. So you can either go ahead and check those manually still, but you better not unless they're actually on the bank statement, which if they were, they should have automatically been reconciled. Unless for some reason the amount was posted wrong in Denali or the bank made an error. But that's your automatic. If you've got many transactions you're doing every month, this one click right here will automatically check to see what's cleared up through the cutoff date at the bank. And it'll go ahead and mark them as cleared for you automatically. All right, and that's your bank reconciliation module. There's no extra charge for yodeling. No, it's included with the bank rec module, so you shouldn't have to pay any extra for that. Okay, on to accounts payable here. If you have any other questions about bank rec, feel free to put those in the chat, but I will definitely get to those if we don't make it by the end of the session today. I'll try to get those questions answered back to you in an email. You can also email me at the end of the webinar after we've disconnected, after the webinar is over. You can go ahead and email me back with any other questions you may have. So one more question real quick. Can you adjust a bank rec that has already been posted? No, you cannot. So you may have to rebuild the bank account total. That is something we didn't cover. Let me show you that real quick. If your beginning balance is wrong for the next month because your reconciliation posted wrong, then you can fix that balance right here where it says rebuild bank account total. That will just adjust the previous reconciled balance at any point if you ever need to do that. So that's up here, bank account, rebuild bank account total. But be careful with that because there's not an actual posting that happens there. It just readjusts the cleared balance in bank rec. It doesn't do anything to GL. So that's how it works here. All right, a couple more questions here. One question is, it looks like the question is, all you have is the toolbar across the top and the menus. You're probably using what's called classic navigation. We talked about that yesterday. So I'll try to send you the instructions on how to turn on the Denali navigation in an email. Shoot me an email after the class and I'll respond with the instructions on how to do that. Another question. Example of how internal control alerts work in bank rec. Internal control alerts basically is set up, we talked about it yesterday. When you're entering bank account activity, you can tell the person that's entering it that they're not allowed to post. You can take that right off of their user, so the manager has to post. But what happens then is the user will, instead of posting, they'll go here and they'll just click this button to send the internal control alert, and they'll select their supervisor and click send. That's all they have to do. They can also type in a message to add to the email. Denali will send a message with this subject line here, but they can add to it in the body of the message if needed. And then the manager gets that message and they can log in and do the posting. Send internal control alerts. That's how that works. General Ledger has the same option for journal entries if needed. And you can also access that through the drop-down menu here. Accounts payable, same options there. When entering bills, send internal control alerts there for the bill entry. Slide that down a little. But there's a lot of activity options for entering bills. There we go. Or under the enter bills menu, there's the option there. Okay, we ready for accounts payable training? see if we can wrap this up in the next hour. Normally we're scheduled to be done in 45 minutes, but accounts payable is pretty extensive, so I'll try to get done as quick as I can for you folks. If you have to leave early before we finish the webinar today, kind of like what happened yesterday, then we are recording these sessions. So we can definitely make the recording available to you within the next week or two. That will be included. You'll be able to have access to the recorded webinar. Okay, so the way it works in accounts payable is you set up the preferences just like you do in BankRec and the other modules, but accounts payable is also tracking a calendar year for 1099 processing. That's only the only thing this is used for is 1099 processing. That's why it may not be your fiscal year. It's always going to be a calendar year. So it's always going to be set that way because 1099s have to be processed on a calendar year. Your integration. Accounts payable is quite generous. It's not so selfish like general ledger, and even BankRec is a little selfish. It only talks to general ledger. But accounts payable will talk to general ledger, same options you had here as you had in BankRec. Also, accounts payable will talk to your inventory. If you have an the inventory module, you can enter supplier invoices in accounts payable, and it'll automatically add the stock items that you purchased from the supplier to your inventory. If you don't have inventory, that'll be turned off. And of course, any checks you write out in accounts payable, you need those to post to the BankRec. And you'll set the default bank account here. And that's just the default. Doesn't mean it's the only bank account you can use. Some of the other options here, there's our auto do to do from again. That doesn't apply in business accounting, only in fund accounting. If you use auto do to do from in BankRec, please use it also in accounts payable. Do not set one module to turn that on and another module to turn that off, or you're going to have cash balances all over the place in GL, and you're not going to know where they are. The BankRec will still keep track of it by bank account, but the GL will only keep track of it by fund if the auto do to is turned off. But if you have it on in one module, it'll dump it all in one fund in that module, but not in the other module if it's not turned on in the other one as well. So make sure that this is checked in all of your modules if you're going to check it in one module. The only modules that use that is BankRec, accounts payable, and payroll. In BankRec, you can also set user-defined. We'll talk about how to do credit cards here in the accounts payable as well to get your question answered there. Don't let me forget. You can set user-defined fields for vendor tracking. This is an option in accounts payable, accounts receivable, inventory, and payroll. You can set these user-defined fields if you need to report your vendors on anything that we don't already have something to report on. You can set a field for that. So you can set these up here. For more detail on how these work, then refer to the accounts payable user guide. And then I can also answer specific questions on these as well. I will show you a couple of examples as we're running through the reporting options here. So here's a question. What if you are using a credit card instead of a check to pay expenses? Well, remember we talked about a few moments ago, if you have the accounts payable module, set up your credit cards here instead of in the BankRec module, because accounts payable will track your credit cards a lot better. So here we have an example of the corporation that uses one credit card. This particular organization, we have one business credit card we use for expenses. So I've got that set up here. To set it up, you have to set up the vendor first. Who do you write the check to when paying the credit card bill? And that's going to be your credit card. And then there's your print options for reports, postings, and the checks that you print out of accounts payable. Now, in BankRec, we talked about setting up bank account codes and linking those to the cash accounts in GL. Those are your control accounts. Accounts payable has to have a connection to GL to the liability accounts. When you're setting up your vendors, each vendor, I mean, you could have hundreds or even thousands of vendors in here. So do I have to set up a separate GL account for each one? No, we don't have to do that like we do in BankRec. You can basically put all of your vendors under a single liability account in the general ledger. And the way Denali does that is it uses what's called the AP code for that. So what does the AP code do? It tracks the vendor balances to the liability accounts in general ledger. So if I bring up one of my AP codes here, accounts payable, there's a good one. Then there it is. When you're setting up an AP code, just like in BankRec, you have to set up a code up to 6 characters, but this is for accounts payable liabilities. Then you can give it a description. You can also assign a default bank account when you're paying vendors that are coded to this AP code. And then you put your aging for your vendors. Now, most people just do 30-day aging periods, but you can be a little more aggressive than that. I, for one, like to pay my bills on time. So even though the bill isn't due in 30 days, I'm only going to put 20 days for the current period on my aging report, and then 10 days for period 1. And the reason for that is that'll show me current bills that are due and payable in the current period, but then it separates out the ones that are due within the next 10 days. If the bill is due in 30 days, then anything in period 1 means it needs to be paid within the next 10 days or it's going to be late. And then if it's in period 2, now we're already past due, but we're only 5 days or less past due. Period 3, now we're the next 5 days past due. So now it's 6 to 10 days. Anything over 10 days past due will be in period 4. So you can set your aging however you want, and you can even do it separate by the different AP codes that you set up in the system if you'd like. And then here is your control account for the accounts payable liability. 2000 is my account number. There's my program, which is 00. It doesn't apply on a liability. But notice there's no fund. Just like the cash account in BankRec, Denali tracks the fund liability separate by fund. So therefore, this account has to be set up in every fund that you're going to be recording expenses for in accounts payable. You must set up a 2000 account for every fund that you're going to be recording the expenses for. And I've got 4 funds, so I have the same exact account set up across my 4 funds. Most people don't use the undistributed. That's basically future liability where it's not distributed yet. You can just use the 2000 account for that as well, or whatever your AP account is. Same one there. The cash account is linked to the bank code. If you don't have the BankRec module, you must add the cash account to the AP code here. And again, it's going to be split by fund, unless you're using auto do to do from. The discount is for early payment discounts. If you pay your bills early to your vendors, this is the account that gets the credit for that discount amount. You'll get a credit posting. It's typically an expense adjustment account is what that would be. 7051. There it is, purchase discount. That's the account I'm using for that. Okay. That's your AP code set up. Once you've set up your AP codes, you have to have at least one in your accounts payable. You can set up multiple AP codes if you're tracking vendors under different liability accounts. Or if you have to pay vendors out of different bank accounts and you want to set default bank accounts for the vendors, you can set up an AP code separately for those different vendors. But once the AP code is set up, now you can go set up your vendors here. Vendor setup is pretty simple. You need a vendor number. There's my American Express vendor. That's my first one. And that's my credit card. But they're still a vendor. I still have to pay the bill every month. So So you can use a vendor number. The vendor number can be whatever you want it to be, even just the vendor name itself, as you can see here. There's the AP code for that vendor. I've got different AP codes here. Some people like to track AP codes separate. Now this one is a separate AP code because it's my restricted fund. So I've separated that out, all my vendors, but that's not required. And the reason why is because the liability will still be separate by fund if it's under the same AP code, unless I'm using a completely separate liability account altogether. It's something like 2100 instead of 2000. But I could still use the 2000 account, just use the same AP code here, and that'll work just fine. Any expenses to my restricted fund will automatically code the liability for that expense to the restricted fund as well. And then when I pay those bills, the cash to pay those bills will come out of that restricted fund's cash. But the reason I have this separately is because this fund is so restricted that it's required to have a separate bank account at the bank. So therefore, I've set up a separate liability code and everything for this restricted fund. So there's your vendor name, status, active, inactive, or temporary. That's for reporting purposes. Product type is an optional field. Basically, all you need to set up a vendor is the number, the AP code, and the name. Everything else is optional. But if you want, you can put in a default expense account for that vendor. This is the default expense. So when I enter a bill for this vendor, it will default to that expense. You set the vendor terms here. If it's net 30, you just put 30 days there, days from invoice day. Or you could set a specific day of the month that the bill is due every month. There's different options for that. And then you fill out the address here. So the question came up in BankRec. Can I fill out a vendor, set up a vendor or a payee, but then when I print the check, have it print someone else on the check for that same payee? Prints a different name on the check. You can do that here in accounts payable. What you'll do is you'll set up the vendor with their address just like you would normally, but then there's another option that says remit to, and you can fill out a different name and address that you want to print on the check instead of the actual vendor itself using the remit to. Just make sure you check this box if you're going to do that. And then that's what prints on the check instead. But if you're not using it, don't check the box. Otherwise, it'll leave a blank on the check because you don't fill it out here. It's not going to print it on the check if you check this box. So you can leave that unchecked and then you can just not worry about this. Or you can check this and fill it in what you want to print on the check exactly. The statistics shows a snapshot of the vendor account, the last invoice, last return or credit memo, last payment, and the current vendor balance. All right. The aging will show a list of all what is called open items in the vendor account. And I can organize this by date, by reference number, by type. When I click on these columns to organize it, I can also search by those items in the history, but not on the aging. To do the search, you have to switch to the history and do the same options there. And now I can search reference number. I can search for a specific invoice number or a check number when I click on reference number here. But the difference between aging and history is the history is just a list of all the transaction in the vendor's history. The aging is what's called open items, transactions that you may or may not still be working with in the vendor history. And so they haven't been purged out of the open items yet. And it will also show the amount left due on each transaction that is still in here. On an invoice, the remaining amount will be the amount due on that specific invoice. On a payment, it's any leftover amount that has not been applied to any invoices yet. That's what the remaining amount will be on payments and credit memos. Okay, Couple of questions here. When reconciling a bank statement, can you do more than 1 month at a time? I suppose you could. You just have to put in the ending balance on the last month's bank statement that you're reconciling and go from there. Also, a question is there a report showing invoices and payments for one vendor? Yes, there is actually. And we'll get to the reports here before we're done. That's called the dated invoice payment report, which is your running vendor tally for each vendor account, or the vendor history. You can show that as well. It's just a different format. But here is just a list of those transactions in the vendor account itself that you can look at. Now in the history, if you're looking at any one of these transactions, let's say we're looking at this payment right here. Say, what did that pay? Well, if you double click, it launches a payment to invoice report for that one payment to show you which invoices that payment paid. And there it is. So there's my check number, and this is the invoice number that it paid. That's a double click in the history tab, not the aging tab, in the history tab. When you double click an invoice, it does the reverse report. It shows the invoice to payment. So it shows you the invoice, and then it shows which payments were applied to that invoice. So that's the invoice right there with the purchase order number. And this is my payment check number that applied to that invoice. So we have payment to invoice report, or the reverse of that is invoice to payment report. And then you would see each thing listed on that report. If you had an invoice that had 3 or 4 different payments paid towards it because they were partial payments, you would have seen that listed out, the payments listed 3 or 4 times, each one separately. Vendor notes, anything you want to type here. Vendor attachments, this is documentation for the vendor if needed, such as a W-9 form or any kind of other documentation, a sales tax exempt certificate, anything you want to attach to the vendor. And then your user-defined fields. These are the values you can enter in for the user-defined fields that you set up in the preferences. And then what that does is when you're running any reports in the system, you can say, only show me vendors that have a value of whatever I put here for that particular user-defined field. That's all I want to see on this report. That's an additional filter. Or only show me vendors that have a specific value in this user-defined field, start to end. You can do a range of values. So how do you attach the W-9? Well, you probably need to scan it in if you don't have it as a PDF or something already. And then once it's scanned in and saved as an actual document on your computer, you just click this button right here and you find that document and attach it in the attachments tab. You just click this little button right here. Make sure you publish it if you want to have access to that document on any workstation. Any user that has vendor access, if you need them to have access to the published or to the documents in the vendor account, make sure that you publish those documents. Otherwise, it just becomes a link to that document on your workstation only, and nobody else will see it. So that's your vendor setup. The vendors are set up now. We're ready to go to work. So in the accounts payable, you know, it's interesting because most clients that use Denali, they actually use the accounts payable module more than any other module. And it's because it seems to me like that most organizations have more transactions to enter in regards to expenses than any other transaction. Hopefully the dollar amounts are higher on the income side, or at least equal if you're a nonprofit or fund accounting. But usually you're going to have to enter a separate transaction for each and every little expense that you incur. And that's done right here in the enter bills. I like to say enter expenses here. This is where you enter your expenses in Denali, right here. Now you can save certain entries as recurring entries. And if you've done that, You can start here and generate the ones you have previously saved as recurring, and they will be added to the current batch that you're in. And then when you click here, and look at this, I'm using multi-batch mode in accounts payable. So that means I can have multiple batches open at the same time. I do have a batch open right now, or I can set up a new batch here. When I go to set up a new batch, just like we saw in General Ledger, you can put the identity if you want, but it will default to the user ID. But I'll just select the batch I'm in right now. And here's my bill entry screen. So entering expenses is pretty simple in Denali. First, you enter the vendor that you're paying the expense to. Then you enter the invoice number and what the PO description is an optional field. You can enter that if you want or leave it blank. Then you come down here. Well, you want to verify your date. The invoice day is the day of the invoice. The GL day is the day you want this entry to hit the general ledger. So if the invoice was dated for June, but it's actually for a July expense, you can do that. You can date the invoice June, but it goes into your July expenses because it'll default the GL date to the invoice day, but you can change that because this is going against July's budget, not June's budget. Then you can do that here. Or the reverse of that. Maybe this needs to go, this was an invoice dated July 7th, but it's actually for June's expenses. So I can date the GL June on that instead of July. The due date is automatically populated based on the vendor terms you set up from the invoice date. But you can edit that for each invoice as needed. And the same with the discount date and the discount amount, either dollar or percent. If it's paid on or before that discount, you get this much off of the bill. On or before that date. If it's paid after that date, the discount will not apply. Then you fill out your expense. And this vendor is already set up to automatically code the expense for me. Because remember, when we looked at the vendor setup, if you double click the vendor here and click view, it lets you open the vendor account. If you're a user that's authorized to do that. And there's my default expense for this vendor. So it automatically puts it in for me if I set it up on the vendor, but I can still change it if I need to. I can still code this to a different expense. This little drop down brings up my chart of accounts from General Ledger, and I can code it to whatever expense I need to. If it's not set up on the vendor, you will have to code the expense when you enter the bill. You cannot leave it blank. And then I just simply save that entry, and that's my expense for that. There's also an option to enter a check. Maybe instead of putting in the bill, I'm just going to go ahead and write the check out to pay July rent. You're going to enter it exactly like you see here with one exception. You're going to check this box, and this now becomes a check entry. And this vendor was set up for electronic payments. That means I'm going online to pay it. Or I can uncheck that if I want to print the check instead. Same information, but now it's asking for check information. If I'm going to print the check, I can leave the check blank, but I still need a check date, and I need the bank account that I'm writing the check out of. These will default based on your vendor setup and your AP code setup. So whether it's done as an immediate or whether it's done as a payable to be paid later determines whether you check this box or not. If it's immediate, it's just going to go right in to the vendor history, but it won't show up as a payment due to that vendor because it's already paid. If you don't check this box, when you post this bill, it goes in as a payable, which means you'll see it on the aging reports and on the vendor, the cash requirements, the bills due, current bills due, and all those reports. The history will show it either way, whether it's paid or not. You will have that in the history. And I'll talk about splitting the expense here in just a moment here. Yeah, good question. A couple of questions about that. So what happens if I need to split the expense, especially in fund accounting? You know, $1,500 is my office rent, but the administration fund only pays $500 of that. So I'm going to list $500 on the first line to administration. The next line, and I could even code my descriptions to that line. Maybe my federal fund is going to pay $250 of that. So it's the same rent expense, but I'm just going to change the fund right there. And then the next line, the rest of it will be paid out of my grants and fellowships fund. So I do GRFL for my funds number. So as you can see, same expense account, just 3 different funds. It's still just one invoice to this vendor. That's all we have, one invoice to this vendor, but it's being split across 3 different expenses. You can split it to different expense accounts, to different funds, different programs, however you need to allocate that, you can do that. Okay, if you use multiple expenses, how do you find which expense number was used for a particular payment in a vendor history? I'll show you that on a report called the expense distribution. It's basically the invoices that you've entered in, how they were distributed, what expenses they will go to. All right, so that's how you split the expense. But there's one other shortcut you can do on that. What if every month you have the same exact split, but instead of a specific dollar amount to each fund, it's actually a percent? Maybe your rent expense varies month to month, but the percentages are going to be the same. In accounts payable, you can set up what's called an accounts payable allocation code right here. And you can set one up, in this example, rent. And then I'm splitting it by percent now across my 3 funds, not by a specific dollar amount. I could do it by dollar amount if I wanted to, but this is specifically designed to do by percent. You know, it's up to you though. You can do a specific dollar amount to each amount when you do the allocation, but the percentage is what it's really for. So that works really well that way. So how does that work? So when I'm entering my rent, instead of a direct expense, I am going to select the allocation option, and then I'll put in my allocation. And when I enter my rent, it automatically splits it for me across the 3 different expenses. You can add additional lines to the current month's invoice if you need to, such as maybe there was repair and maintenance added to this month's invoice. So you can add that, and it'll add it to the total invoice and expense it where it needs to go. All right, so we save that entry. Verify accuracy, there's my edit report. This shows me what I've entered. But here's what I want to show you here. I want to show you how this hits the general ledger. Matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and post this. If you flagged anything to be printed as an immediate check, you can print the immediate checks here. If not, you just go ahead and post. So on your posting, here's what you get. You get your invoice posting report and your general ledger posting. I'll have both of those load up here. There's the invoice posting. And there's the general ledger. But notice how every debit has an opposing credit separate by fund. There's my $750 debit to the expense for administration, and the credit goes to a separate liability account for administration. Same liability account. In this case, it's 2050. My big Sky vendor is being tracked in 2050, but it's different funds. Those are all being tracked separate by fund because you have to keep your funds balanced. Now, if you're business accounting, none of that applies. You can still use the allocations, but you're just going to get one big credit to your liability account for the entire entry, and the debits will be allocated and split however you split the expenses. But because we're fund accounting, we also have to split the credits in order to keep the funds balanced. And that's how it works in fund accounting. Close all tabs. I'll bet you I just closed the PDF program now. Have to load that back up again. Some other options when you're entering bills. Oh, now I got to create a new batch. See, it doesn't even let me select one because I don't have any open batches now. So I'll just go ahead and create a new batch. Some other options are you can save invoices as recurring if you want. You can also, like I say, if you have inventory, you can enter a supplier invoice for specific stock items. So instead of a description, now it's asking you for a stock number from the inventory module. And how many of those are we purchasing? And what is the per unit cost for each one? This will also post a $25 quantity addition to this inventory stock item at this value per unit. You may have 2 or 3 stock items that you're adding on your supplier invoice. And you just verify the amounts. These amounts are coming from the inventory setup itself, the last cost, the last time you purchased this item, but you can edit those for this expense as needed. But notice the GL expense account is grayed out. That's the inventory asset account set up in inventory for those stock items. And then you can add the shipping and handling if you have any as a direct expense. I'll just say shipping. There you go. But now I got to fill in the expense account for that. Grab one there. And there we go. So there's my total invoice for those items. There's even an option, rather than directly expensing the shipping, you could do what's called landing. And what that does is that will take your shipping costs and it will incorporate it in a per unit basis to each stock item and add that as part of the value to the stock. So therefore, there's no expense account for that. It will just add that as part of the cost to the inventory value if you use the landing. Some other options are prepaid expenses that you can enter. When you do a prepaid expense, insurance is a good example. Typically, you're going to split that across multiple months, but the bill is due today. You got to pay it this month, but you want the expense to be allocated across several different periods. $100 to July, and then I'll put in my insurance. I'll just put in an expense account for us there. But now you're going to add what's called a prepaid account. This is going to be an asset account for prepaid expenses. Let's say this was actually done in June. Let's back this up to June. So I'll do July, then I'll do August, September, October. I'll fill that all out for the whole year, however much I need to allocate it for each month going to the specific period. And then when I post this, what it does is on this day up here, June 17th, it will post the credit to the liability and the debit to my prepaid asset account. But then on each expense day here, July, August, on the prepaid, it will transfer that from the prepaid asset to the actual expense account itself on the specific date that that's to be expensed for. And so when you're doing the prepaids, it's just basically like entering the 12 entries for the entire year all in one step here. You just fill out the 12 lines. And then the bill is still due and payable in the current period, but it doesn't hit the budget except for the small amount each month as it needs to, and hit your revenue and expenses. Okay, question. How do I enter an invoice where you've set up payment terms on the vendor? There's really no way to track that on a specific due date for the same invoice where you have multiple due dates. It's just going to have one due date. So probably just put the 90-day due date on there. And then you just have to keep track that you get, well, you could do the 30-day, I guess. The 30-day. So you would enter the 30-day due date. And then when you make that payment, that is one thing that you can adjust is the due date on posted invoices. So if you make the payment for the first payment on that 3-payment invoice, after that payment is posted, you can go up to the options, the table maintenance, and you can adjust the due date on that invoice and bump it out to the next month's due date and then save. That is an option you can do on any invoice that's already posted. Then when you make the next payment, you can adjust that due date one more time. But it doesn't let you do it all in one step when you're entering the bill. So again, you'll find that in options, table maintenance, adjust posted item due date. Kind of a hidden option there, but that is an option you can do. All right, now that we've entered our bills, now we need to pay bills, right? So you can pay bills automatically by selecting this option. And this is where if you pay different vendors out of different bank accounts, it's good to have different AP codes set up for those vendors. For each bank account you're going to be paying bills out of that's coded to the specific vendors, you're going to have a separate AP code because the AP code will make that link between accounts payable and bank rec, just like it does between accounts payable and general ledger. So you can select a specific AP code that you want to pay, and only the vendors in that AP code category get paid. This is your check date. You want to pay all bills that are due within this date range. It always backs up to the first of the current fiscal calendar, all the way up to the end of the current month that you're in, which in this case is July. And when you click OK, the system goes through all of the bills that you have posted that are not paid yet, and it generates payments for those bills. And there's only one that it generated. I guess there was only one bill I didn't have posted. But the payment hasn't posted yet. The payment is just entered for you automatically. So you don't have to go here and manually enter it. And if you go to the next step, you run your edit report, it shows you what it just generated for automatic payments. And there it is on my other screen. Hang on. So here we have one vendor to American Express entered in for these 3 invoices that were due. And notice how it took all the invoices under that one vendor and it wrote out one single check for those. If you're doing immediate checks, you can't do that. It's one check per invoice. But if you pay bills either automatically or do the adjust pay bills manually, you can pay multiple invoices to the same vendor on one check. Close it here. So how do you pay bills manually? Well, let me clear that payment out so we can try that again. Only this time, instead of going here, I'm going to go here to pay it manually. So you check this box, and I'm going to enter a payment. That's my transaction. The date of my payment, who is my vendor. I can type in the vendor, or if I double click, I can select from the list of vendors of who I'm going to pay. And then I just come down here and I pick and choose which invoices I want to pay. These are 3 invoices that are posted to that vendor. So I can pick and choose which ones I want to pay, or I can select all to pay them all if I want. Maybe I don't want to pay this one here, so I'll leave that one off. The system generates a check to pay those 2 invoices. If there are any credit memos or adjustments that I can apply to an invoice, I can select that from this column here. The adjustments to apply, those are vendor credit memos or debit invoices is what they're called, that have posted to the vendor, and now you're going to apply those, which will reduce the check amount for you. If the bills are paid early, the discount will automatically calculate, but you can manually edit the discount amount here as well. But remember, whatever you enter here will post to that discount account on the AP code that was set up. On the AP code right here. That's the GL account that gets the credit when you're entering a discount on a payment. And then this is the amount that the check will be paying towards each invoice. The total check is up here, but down here you can specify the amount that you're paying off on that invoice. It'll default the full amount due, but if you don't want to pay the entire invoice, you can edit that. I'm only going to pay $200 on this invoice. So it'll leave that invoice open with a $50 balance due. And notice how it automatically adjusts my check amount for me now, because I'm changing how much I'm paying towards that invoice here. So the question, well, how do I enter a check that I already wrote? I don't need Denali to generate the check for me. I need to just enter it in the system. You're going to do it exactly like this. You do exactly like you see here. Make sure you fill it out correctly so that it comes out to what you actually wrote it for. But you'll have to enter the check number because you're not going to print it. That's the only difference. You just fill out the check number here of what you wrote. Now, if you haven't posted the bill yet to pay for that check, you'll have to go back and do the enter bills and just enter it as an immediate check. You can do it that way. And then you can code it directly to the expenses where it needs to go. Electronic payments, that's another question. Yes, electronic payments, same thing. You still have to enter them in here, but you'll just fill out some kind of a reference number here as the check number, as long as it's not something you've already used. You can also set the vendor to be paid electronically, whereas if you do that, then you can have Denali automatically generate those EFT reference numbers for you. But that's not necessary. You don't have to do that unless you want to. If you don't want to have to figure out what to use for a reference number, that would be a simple way to do that. If you leave the check number blank, you save that, then you run your edit report, and then you can print the check. But if it's an electronic check or if you've hand filled it out, you can skip the print vendor check and go right to posting. A couple of things I like to point out though, if you're using the automatic check numbering for electronic payments, after you're done here or here, either one, before you go to the edit report, play like this arrow points up here to this button. That's the button that'll generate those electronic payment numbers for you. And then come back down to your edit report. Then you can print any checks that are not EFT in the current batch. But before you post, I also recommend play like this arrow points up here to your check register. If you want to get a check register for the current batch of checks you just issued, this report right here will give you that. And then you can post. Question, is there a way to check the total amount for a vendor in the enter bills if you are adding numerous invoices prior to the post bills? If I understand you right, you're trying to figure out how much those bills are going to increase the vendor balance. If that's the question, then not really. When you go in here to enter bills, oh, come on, don't lock up on me now. Oh, boy, I don't know what happened. It just locked up on me and then crashed. I killed it. Ah. Okay, I must have clicked something a little, or double clicked on it. Those are single click icons. And I'm working on my little laptop here at the house. Still working from home. this COVID-19 virus is not killing us all, but it's making us go crazy. So I have to stay home until that clears, until the pandemic lets up. But when you go here to enter bills, see if I can get it to work this time. Oh, now I got a locking error. Hang on. Let me go into a new batch. That'll be easier. Time to call tech support. I have a locking error, right? All right. So when I go in here to enter bills, when I bring up the vendor, it will show me the total balance due up here for that vendor. But as I'm adding bills to the batch, it doesn't update this total balance due until I post. That's the thing. So you're not going to see that updated until after you post. Will the check register also include the manual written checks? Yes, it will if you've entered them in before posting. If you enter those checks in, you can still run that check register, even if you don't print the checks out. How would you post EFT payments that are generated from the vendor side, so paid on the vendor website? Exactly like I was showing you there. You're going to go to Pay Bills, and you're just simply going to enter that payment with some kind of an EFT reference number here. Or if the vendor is set up for electronic payments, you can have Denali generate that number for you. But it does have to be entered in order to have it recorded in Denali, even if you paid it on the website outside of Denali somewhere. Because Denali doesn't pay the vendor. Denali just issues the check to pay the vendor, or you enter the payment if you paid the vendor some other way. You enter that here in Denali. Okay, let's do this. Enter bills, clear bills. And I'm still locked out of that batch. See if I can get this to unlock for me. Clear payments. Yes. Okay. So I need to clear that other batch out real quickly here. This is where tech support comes in. Give me just a sec here. But yes, you can enter those payments. They do have to be put into Denali. There's no way to just have Denali automatically put those payments in for you. Fund accounting. Okay. Now I should be able to go into that batch. And now we're locked. Okay, very good. Okay. Let's just delete the batch. Boy, I don't know what I did, but I locked this up bad. So we're going to clear it out and reset it. There we go. All cleared. When you enter those payments, you'll just enter those in, just like we were showing, with the check number or electronically. How does positive pay work? So for those of you who don't know what positive pay is, basically what that is a check verification system that you set up directly with your bank. Whenever you're setting up a business bank account at the bank does offer an option called positive pay, where every check has to be verified before the bank will actually pay that check when it hits the bank. And the way it works is, basically, whenever you issue a check out of that account, you have to notify the bank that you have issued that check. And you basically send the bank the information on the check, which would include the vendor, the payer, who you're paying it to, pay to the order of, the vendor name, the date of the check number, and the amount. All four of those have to be validated through positive pay. Otherwise, the bank will not clear that check. So it's a verification. Most banks, what happens is if any check hits the account that you haven't verified, they'll send you some kind of a notification, usually through email, that you have checks that have hit the account that day that have not been verified. And you'll still have the opportunity to log into the bank's website and confirm those checks or reject them if they're not valid checks, so that you don't have your accounts getting hacked into. The reason for that is because checks are really not that secure without positive pay, because every time you issue a check to somebody, your routing number and account number is printed on the bottom of that check, and everybody that handles that check will have access to those numbers. So positive pay will secure your account to prevent any fraudulent activity out of your bank account. The way Denali does positive pay is when you enter checks in the pay bill section, or even immediate checks and enter bills, before you post, then you have the option through the menus up here, enter bills or pay bills, depending on where you entered the check, to generate a positive pay file. And what that does is that creates a list. It's just a text file, basically, that gives the information for each check. It will show the vendor name, the amount of the check, the date of the check, and the check number for each check in that batch of checks. And most banks will have the option to log into their website and upload that file. So you don't have to go through and verify each check one at a time on the bank's website. You can just simply upload the positive pay file, and then the bank gets that file and it says, yep, these checks are all verified now. So when they hit the bank, there's no flag. Don't go ahead and pay them. On Denali, you can set that up. You just go up to the pay bills and set up generate your positive pay file after you've entered the payments, either automatically or manually. Automatically or manually, but there's no button here for positive pay. You have to go up to the menu to get to that. Or under payment tasks, you do have that option over here on the left as well. Generate positive pay right there. So if you did want to set that up with your bank, you have to make sure to upload that file every time you issue checks. Otherwise, those checks will get flagged when they hit the bank. All right. So real quick, let's go through some of the other transaction types. In the enter bills, you have the option to enter credit card transactions. You can do that by checking this box here. And the way that works is, let's say I'm going to Harris Office Supply to buy some office supplies. Here's my invoice number. By the way, your invoice numbers cannot be duplicated for the same vendor. Every time you enter an invoice number, it can't be one you've already entered and posted for that vendor. Then here's my supplies. Now, normally, if I have an invoice from Harris Office that I'm entering, I'll just do it this way. Put in my office supplies here, and then put in my GL expense account for that, whatever that is. I'll just grab one real quick. Oh, I need an amount. There we go. That's good. So there's my bill for Harris Office Supplies. But what if I was actually at the office supply store and I used the American Express card to pay this? So what I would do in that case, if vendor has terms of an early payment discount and 1099 applicable, we'll turn those off for the moment. So I'll enter this in as a credit card transaction. Same information, but now I need a credit card reference number. You can use the same as the invoice number that you use for the vendor, but I always recommend putting in an abbreviated name for the vendor first before that reference number, because that makes it a lot easier when reconciling the credit card statement to see what those charges were, because they're going to be listed here with this reference number, the credit card reference number, in your list of reconciliation. And then what credit card did I use? I used my American Express card right there. There we go. So now I save and post that. And what that'll do is that'll post that payable, but not to Harris Office Supplies. It'll show Harris Office Supplies paid in full. Instead, it'll post that payable to American Express. So now when I go here to pay bills, I now have another bill due to American Express. But this is how you're going to pay the American Express bill every month. You get the bill in the mail, the credit card bill. You say, okay, now we need to pay that bill. But you're also going to reconcile the statement at the same time. What you'll do is you'll just go through, and if the charge is on the statement, there's my vendor, then I mark it off as an item to be paid for this current month's bill. If it's not on the statement, leave it out. That'll be on next month's bill. I'll pay it then. It's still outstanding, in other words. Just like clearing outstanding checks in bank recs, you clear the cleared credit card charges that are on the credit card statement using accounts payable payment to do that. So the question is, what about debit cards? Well, debit cards are not credit cards. So they have to either be entered in, those charges have to be entered in as an immediate check, but instead of a check, it's a debit card. So maybe you could preface the reference number with the letters DC for debit card, and then some kind of a reference number for that. They do have to have a reference number as the check number. And this is the bank account that the debit card is linked to. So instead of credit card, you'll just do immediate for debit card. All right, now back to the pay bills. Let's say I've already got a bill posted, but I'm going to call the vendor and I'm going to make a payment to them for a bill that I've already posted, but I'm going to use my credit card to do that. There is an option in the transaction type to make a payment using the credit card. So let's say I'm going to pay my rent expense on the credit card this month. Ouch. So same thing, before the reference number, maybe enter the vendor first. So it'll show up in your credit card reconciliation. And then which credit card am I using? I'm using my American Express. On which bill am I paying? I'm paying this bill with the American Express card instead of writing a check to pay that bill. So now instead of issuing a check, it just transfers the liability from this vendor down to this vendor, is what that does. Okay, questions. Does the month have to be closed out in order for prepaids to post? Well, there's not really an official month-end close, but there is a period-end task you're going to do in accounts payable called process prepaids here. And yes, you do need to process that at month-end in order to transfer those expenses from the prepaid asset account to the actual expense account for the current month. Now, if you forget to do that for 2 or 3 months, that's okay. It'll automatically post those expenses to the right dates, to the right accounts, up to the current date for those prepaids. Any of them where the date hasn't come yet, like if I was to do this today, it wouldn't do anything for August yet, but it would do any of them that hasn't already processed for July, June, May, where the expense date was dated today or earlier, whenever I generate those prepaids. And that's just a direct posting journal entry. You click on that button, click OK, and it does a direct posting to the general ledger only to transfer the prepaids to the actual expenses for that month. Do you enter interest expense and other fees through this entry or general journal? Anything you need to code to a vendor must go through the enter bill. Or if it's a payment or adjustment, it must go through the pay or adjust bill. Any standard invoices are done through enter bills. So if it's got to be coded to a vendor, then it's going to go here. But there's something else. If you're making a journal entry to your 2000 liability account, that's a no-no. That is the control account for your vendors in AP. So instead of making the journal entry, you're going to come in here and pick which vendor you need to make that entry for and code it through here. You can do regular expenses this way, or if you need to do negatives, it's a -1 quantity, not dollar amount. That's like entering a vendor credit memo, and it credits the expense and it'll debit the liability when you do it that way. But it's the quantity you want to use there, not the dollar amount. You can do positives and negatives on the same entry as many lines as you need. And if the net amount is a positive, it's a bill. If the net amount is a negative, it's a credit memo. That's what that's going to be. The only thing you don't have to include in your journal entry here is the liability account. Or if it's an immediate, you don't include the cash account because that's going to be the net amount. However, you cannot do a net negative total to cash. You can to the liability, but not to cash. So that's basically like a deposit to the bank. You'd have to do that directly in bank rec. Because this would be a check coming out of the bank if it was a positive number. You can also make adjustments to your vendors here in the adjust screen. The balance adjustment, that's where you're going to adjust the vendor balance, either increase or decrease the vendor balance rather than making a journal entry. So this is better to use if it's just an adjustment you need to make. The enter bills is better to use if it's an actual credit memo from the vendor, or if it's a return where you sent something back to the vendor so they credited you back for it. That's where you would use the negative in the enter bills. But this one, you don't use negative numbers at all because there's no quantities. All you're doing is adjusting dollar amounts. If you're decreasing, that's going to make it a negative automatically. If you're increasing, it'll be a positive. But typically, this is used for adjustments, or if you need to void a previously entered invoice that you've posted already, you can use the balance adjustment to void that invoice. Case in point, let's go to Big Sky. We have an invoice for $1,500. If I need to void that, I just double click the apply to here. That's the invoice, open item for this vendor. Now I need a reference number for the void entry as well. So I'll just do a copy and do a -C on the end for credit or correction or whatever you want to call that. Now, if it was allocated, you'll have to allocate the adjustment too, in order to void it out to the general ledger where it needs to go, because it's going to credit whatever expense accounts you put here by the amounts here. And then don't forget to apply that line to the original invoice. That's what this apply box is. So anytime you need to void an invoice or just do a miscellaneous adjustment to accounts payable, don't do a journal entry. Use this screen right here. If it's a credit memo, you can use enter bills and just do a -1 quantity. And that makes it a credit memo. If it's stock items that you're returning back to the vendor, you select which stock item, and you select how many you're returning by putting it in as a negative quantity and the per unit cost. And then it does the credit memo for that. But it's always in the quantity where the negative goes, not the dollar amount. And it'll give you a negative on the total automatically. All right, so since most of our checks are cut out of AP, this is where you go to void checks as well. It's going to be done right here. If the check was entered here or here in the accounts payable module, you're going to go here to the adjust pay bills to void a check. And to do that, the option you want is payment correction, which is says void. That is void check. So in your notes for today's class, write down payment correction equals void check. And that's done in the adjust pay bills and accounts payable. Pretty simple to do. You select the vendor that you wrote the check to. Then you come down here and you enter the check number, or if you double click, you can select the check number from the list of outstanding checks here. I'll just select the last check I posted here. I'll do that one because this was an electronic payment, so I'll do this one instead. But here's the thing, when you void a check, what happens is it simply just unpays the bill. So typically you would enter the reference number that you unpay, but you also must add something to that number because it cannot be a duplicate for the original number. You can't post the same number twice. So what I always tell everybody is add a -V. That way it's referencing the same invoice number, but it's adding something different to it so that it's not an exact duplicate. That way you won't have any problems with posting. And then you enter the check amount here for the check cash amount that you're voiding. That's all you have to do if you're business accounting. But if you're fund accounting, we have to establish which fund are we reestablishing the liability for when we void this check. And then this will put the liability to the correct fund. And you can split that with different lines if needed. When you post this entry, it will go into the bank rec and void this check, and it will also reverse it out in the general ledger. But it's going to add the amount back due onto the vendor. So now this will show I owe $3,000 to the vendor instead of $1,500. Because all we're doing is unpaying the bill. If we have to void the bill itself, that's going to be a separate step. After you post this check or this void, we posted it, then we're going to do our balance adjustment and void the bill. Good question. What are the invoice numbers that it uses to be paid later when you void a check? That's these numbers you enter down here. That's why I say use the -V, so it's not a duplicate, but it's still the same original invoice number, just with the -V added to indicate that that was unpaid because of a void check. That's going to show up in the vendor history as a bill to be paid. Now, it'll be listed as a payment correction instead of an invoice, but it basically works exactly like an invoice. It's going to be due and payable just like an invoice. All right. So real quick, we are running out of time. I apologize for stringing this out so long, guys. There's just so much to cover. Not enough time. So real quick, let's take a look at some of the AP reports that are available. The AP aging report is about the most popular one. It basically shows a list of vendor invoices that are still due and not yet paid, and also gives the aging for each vendor account based on the aging set up on the AP codes. And then you get totals at the bottom for the different periods that you're aging on. Now, I ran this in condensed. The condensed version will list out each invoice, as you can see here, in a single line under each vendor that's due, and the amount still due on each invoice. And then you have your aging. Here's the current period, and here's 51 and over based on my aging. And then this is the total due. There's my Big Sky invoice. That one's current. And that's the total. Those are the only two vendors I owe. So there's my grand total for all of my accounts payable. The detail section does what you are asking. What expenses did those invoices go to? If I run this in detail, I get a list of all the expenses that it went to as well. But this is going to be a lot more pages if you do that, especially if you allocate a lot. So for my first invoice, these are the expense lines. Then my next invoice, these are the expense lines. The next one, these are the expense lines under this vendor. And there's the total. Invoice, but it was coded to 4 expenses. So here's the vendor. Under that, I have the invoice. Under that, I have all the expenses for that invoice. And there you go. So the aging doesn't show partial payment in the detail on the summary. Correct. It will show the amount due on the invoice. So if the invoice was partially paid, it'll show that. I'll show that again to show you real quick. Now, I haven't posted any payments to these invoices, so they're going to still show the full amount due. I know we entered a payment a few minutes ago, but we never posted it. So, oh, I must have done summary instead of condensed. Summary just gives you the vendor total. Yeah, it doesn't give you the list of invoices. So run the condensed to get the list of invoices, or the details to see all the expenses for each invoice. There it is. So here's the original invoice amount, but then here's the amount still left due on that invoice. And if it was partially paid, this amount would be less than what your original amount was. It doesn't show which payments paid that here, though. It just shows the current amounts that are still due on the current invoices. That's all this report shows. Now, if you had any unapplied payments or unapplied credits, you would see those as a debit entry on the aging report if they had amounts due. So the question is, what if a vendor asks which checks were used to pay which invoices? How do I see that? You're going to run the report here called the history report, but you're going to select the payment to invoice report. And then you're going to select which vendor you want to run it for, or for all vendors, however you want to run that. And that will show you that information. It'll show you the list of payments during that date range and which invoices those payments paid. So here's the first payment for this vendor. This is the invoice it paid. Then it goes to the next vendor. This is the payment. This is the invoice it paid. That's called a payment to invoice report. So this vendor had several payments, and each one has the invoice listed under each payment. See if I could find one that had multiple invoices. Here we go. Here's a payment, and then it was applied to this invoice, this payment correction, because it was a void check, so it became an invoice, this invoice, and this invoice, all three of those on this one payment. But what if you want to see the list of invoices and which payments applied to the invoice instead? So instead, you're going to do the invoice to payment. Instead of payment to invoice, it's invoice to payment. Now it lists out all the invoices and which payments paid the invoices, instead of listing out the payments and which invoices they were applied to. The reverse. And there it is. So you see the invoice first, and there's the payment that paid that. There's my invoice. There's the payment. If I had multiple payments applied to the same invoice, I would see that listed out here, the date for each one and the amount of each payment. This is my original invoice date, original invoice amount. And then the payments are listed out there. This will also include any credit memos applied to an invoice as well. A credit memo is called a debit invoice in Denali, a DR invoice. In accounts payable, that is. All right. Any other questions? Auditors always need a list of the AP due at a specific date. A lot of invoices will receive after the year end, but will be posted back to the year end. How do we get a printout of the AP to a specific date that ties to GL? Good question. There is a special report called the dated invoice payment report that'll do that specific thing. If I want to see what my vendor balances were back on any specific day, say March 31st, I can run that. The best way to do it is just do the summary. You just get the balance to each vendor. But if you want to see a list of their history along with that, that's where the detail comes in. And you can go back as far back as you want to in the history for that. But you don't need to see vendors with a zero balance if that's what you're after, is to match it to the balance sheet. And that will show you the list of their transactions with a running balance, and then you get the ending balance as of that previous date, not as of today, but as of March 31st in this example. This was the balance a year before. These are the transactions throughout the year. This is the ending balance. And all other vendors had a zero balance on March 31st, so it doesn't include any other vendor. All right, guys, we are out of time. Boy, sorry about all this. If the vendor totals were not reset at the beginning, so let me answer the rest of your questions in an email. Go ahead and type those in here while we're connected, or send me an email there, and I will get those answered for you. I did want to show you real quick the 1099 processing. That's done pretty easily in Denali. You just simply basically select the option to run the 1099 form, and then you select the pre-printed forms for copy A, or for all the copies if you have those. You can use the plain paper forms for any copies except copy A. Copy A requires the pre-printed form. And then you go ahead and print the 1099s. If you're using pre-printed forms, you make sure those forms are inserted in the printer. Plain paper forms can be printed on plain paper. And this is what they look like. The 1096 form is also included in that. It prints that out for you as well. So that is doable. If you wanted to electronically file those, you have to be set up directly with the IRS to do so. And then you can go ahead and process those and save those as a file somewhere. Default was drive A, because that's what it used to be. And then you can upload those to the IRS directly. All right, guys. Sorry about going over so long today. We had a lot of fun, though, I hope. Yeah, send me your questions. The questions that are coming through right now in the question box, I'll be sure to get those answered for you. I'll just send you guys an email to answer those back. Wish we had more time. We have a lot of fun when we're having these webinars, and sometimes the time gets away from me, so I appreciate the patience that you have with me on that. Tell your friends that if they've missed out on the last of the webinar today, that they can still get the recording. That will be made available within the next couple of weeks, I believe. They're going to have those recordings made available to you guys. So be sure to tell everybody that had to log off early that you know, and we'll be sure to send out notices when they're available as well. Yes, I can definitely send out instructions on how to void checks specifically for you, Leanne. Make sure we take care of that. There's the customer service phone line. If you have any questions or need any specific help, just give them a call. They can open a support ticket, or you can schedule an appointment with me directly for one-on-one training, and I can definitely help you just by calling that number. You can also send your questions to me at training@cougarmountain.com. Just go ahead and send those questions over, and I'll get them answered for you. Might take me a day or so to get to those questions with the schedule I currently have, but we will get you taken care of. So tomorrow's session, we're going to be going over the payroll. The entire session is devoted to payroll, because that one is a little bit complex. And I don't know how we're going to cram it all into 2 hours, but I'm going to do my best. So be patient with me. We'll be sure to get it taken care of and get you covered one way or the other. So be sure to tune back in tomorrow, 1 p.m. Eastern time or 10 a.m. Pacific time. Same time, same place. You'll get a separate invite for that, though. So make sure that you log in with the separate invite for the payroll. If you are interested in the payroll and you haven't registered for that, it's not too late. You can contact your account executive at 1-800-388-3038, and they will get you signed up for it. All right, guys, it's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much. And for those of you registered for tomorrow, I will see you then tomorrow. Look forward to it. Have a great day.